name's Andrew Smith, if you don't know me. I'm the pastor here at the Presbyterian Church, and it's been an honor and a delight for us to be hosting the speaker series. And so you're all very welcome in our space. If you haven't been here before and need the facilities, you can go out this door and down the hall, and you'll find them there. I'm delighted tonight that Christie's speaking. Bo's going to introduce her in a moment, but our leadership here have started to think about what placemaking means for us here in the borough. It's been very early discussion so far, but something that I think is exciting to think about, and just how we can improve our place here in the town and be a benefit to those around us. So welcome, Christie, and I'm going to hand over to Bo, who will introduce her.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Andrew and PCKS, for once again just allowing us to use this space. I want to say thank you to Sierra in the back. So this will be translated, so anyone that needs this in Spanish, if you're listening to me now, you probably don't, but you can pick up a recorder in the back and hear the translation throughout. So Sierra, thank you for doing that again. Also want to announce we have an upcoming program that I actually don't know all of what Christie's going to talk about, but I think it goes along with it, called Kennett Blooms. This is the second year we're doing it. So you can find out more information at the back. You'll see the tree branches with seed packets. So pick up those seed packets. I think after tonight's talk, you'll be inspired to do so. You can find out more information about what Kennett Blooms is, kind of what we're planning for this spring, to bring kind of love and beauty and placemaking activities to Kennett through that program. So this is the fourth talk in our Kennett Square How We Build Matters speaker series. A lot of the other talks I think have focused on, I opened up, talked somewhat about kind of how the built environment affects financial sustainability of places. Our third talk also focused on kind of how infrastructure and investments, those kind of investments impact financial sustainability of places. But there's a book that has really impacted me called The Original Green by a guy named Steve Mouzon. And he points out in there that nothing is sustainable unless it's lovable. The exact quote from his book is, "If a building or place cannot be loved, it will not last." Any serious conversation about the sustainability of a building or place must begin with the issue of lovability. He says we have to ask the question, did those that built this place intend for it to be loved? And as we are building, we have to ask the same question. Are the places that we're creating, the places that we're building, are they intended to be loved? Are they built, with the intent that they could be loved and loved into the future? So our speaker tonight is one of the best thinkers and writers that I know to help us kind of think about what it means to love a place and how we can build lovable places. Our speaker tonight is Christie Purifoy. Christie earned a PhD in English literature from the University of Chicago. She's also the author of 3 books, is that correct? 3 books. Roots and Sky, A Journey Home and 4 Seasons. Placemaker, Cultivating Places of Comfort, Beauty, and Peace. And her most recent book is Garden Maker. I know the latter 2 books, Placemaker and Garden Maker, are going to be available at the end of the talk on the back table. And as you will learn, Christie is a local who loves this place. So join me in welcoming Christie Purifoy.
Thank you so much for that introduction, that welcome. I think I started thinking and writing about placemaking probably 5 years ago, and I've had the opportunity to speak about it now for a few years, usually to audiences, whether virtually or in person around the country, sometimes even people around the world. And when I talk about placemaking, I'm telling stories of this place, my home, Southern Chester County, and people often say to me, "Your home sounds amazing." And I always say, it is. But it's a real privilege now to be here amongst my neighbors. So thank you. Let's get started. Okay, I'm very eager to talk about beauty tonight. But believe it or not, I'm going to begin with bugs. Yes, with flying insects. And if that doesn't sound like what you came here for, just bear with me. I grew up in Texas, and I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's farm. And very occasionally, we were allowed as children to bottle feed a calf. One time, my cousin even killed a rattlesnake outside of my grandmother's back door near the porch. And yet, my most vivid memories of time on the farm involved moths, winged insects. If we drove anywhere, the car lights, the windshield would just be covered in fluttering, whispering sounds of those winged insects. At night, when I would sleep in the back bedroom, I'd be kept awake by the sounds of bugs tapping on the bare bulb right outside my window. And so I was thinking about that recently and realizing that I don't think my children have ever had that experience. So I went to Google to find out, and I thought, like, could there be more moths in North Texas than Pennsylvania? But I found this, an AP news story from just a few years ago out of Oxford, PA, about the decline in insect populations and how we are finally noticing the decline because we are wondering what happened to bug-splattered windshields. So apparently, it's not just me. But why am I talking about bugs? What in the world do bugs have to do with beauty? And what do they have to do with the art of placemaking? So leaving aside the fact that a decline in insects, it's very concerning, of course. We have a local entomologist, Doug Tallamy, who is really changing the world in this regard. He's just out of the University of Delaware. But he has told us that if we lose our insects, we will have, in his words, total ecosystem collapse. So it is a very serious problem. But here is why I'm beginning with bugs in this talk about beauty. Some of us might find insects beautiful. Some of us might find them gross or maybe terrifying. But fewer bugs means fewer birds. And that means that if we have fewer insects, every place we inhabit will be less beautiful because it will have less bird song. The glorious soundtrack of spring will go quiet. It has already gone quieter. And at the risk of stepping on some toes, we know that part, though only part of the explanation for declining insect populations, is a loss of habitat. So we have gone from appreciating this, really, to just valuing, especially around our homes, this. But despite how it's beginning to sound, I'm not here to shame anyone for their dandelion-free lawn grass. I'm beginning this talk with bugs and birds because if we are going to talk seriously about beauty in the context of our placemaking, then we must remember how interrelated all of the parts are with the whole. So insects might seem irrelevant to conversations about beauty, but bugs are connected to bird song, among other things. And so when we talk about beauty, we must think big. We must seek out the larger story. We must pay attention to connections, to patterns, to webs of relationship. And as well, we must be willing to loosen our grip on our own personal aesthetic preferences. Because of course, we don't all point to the same things when we think of beauty, right? And because there is this subjective element in our perceptions of beauty, we might understandably, I think, be tempted to just to leave the concept out of our collective conversations about placemaking. Just leave it out, because while I might love this in my garden, my neighbor might really prefer this, right? But does this mean that we add beauty to the list of things like politics and religion that polite people simply don't talk about? And obviously my answer is an emphatic no. When I was 21, I moved to the south side of Chicago to attend graduate school. And on my first visit to that neighborhood, I could see on my map that the enormous blue expanse of Lake Michigan, it was just a few blocks east of the campus. And I had never been to Lake Michigan before. And if you've ever been to Chicago, you know that it is laid out like a perfect grid, which can only happen in a flat Midwestern city like that. So it was very easy to pick a numbered street and start walking east and try to find this lake. And I was doing well until I came to the elevated tracks. And then what I saw was a damp, dark, tunnel-like space underneath those tracks. And I was not a city girl, and I just saw puddles, and I saw peeling paint of old murals, and I thought I had made a mistake. I thought I hadn't read my map correctly. This couldn't possibly be the right way to the big, beautiful lake and the 57th Street beach, and so I turned around. I never saw the lake on that visit. But then I ended up living in the city for 10 years, and probably walked under those tracks for, probably once a day, twice a day. And I realized that those dark spaces under the tracks, I began actually, I think, to welcome them, because they offered some brief shelter from rain, from snow, from the sun. Some of them had little tiny coffee shops tucked in underneath, which was really excellent. Many of them featured colorful murals. Some of the older murals that had the peeling paint, they were actually quite incredible. They were old, but they showed neighborhood history. Sometimes they had figures dressed in bell bottoms and fringed vests. So the spaces that I had thought were ugly were actually little art galleries. They were little time capsules. And it didn't take me long to lose all sense of them as ugly places, which is how I had first seen them. They became necessary pass-through places that I used every day that nevertheless slowed me down, gave me something good to notice, something to think about. So beauty matters, but sometimes we need a little more time, a little more understanding, even sometimes a little more education in order to appreciate the unique beauty of a place. So for instance, I appreciated these spaces more, and I appreciated the murals more because I took a historic mural tour with a local community group. And they helped me to appreciate what I was actually seeing there. So perception is really important for our placemaking. It hardly matters how we make a place if large numbers of people perceive it to be ugly or unwelcoming or uncomfortable. But perception is largely shaped by culture and by the arts. So while my perception of the place under the tracks was changed, really it was changed through art and the little places that were made under there. And I don't think that it would have worked so well if you had appealed to my reason. If you had said, these are functional places, they're perfectly safe, there you go. But the art in those spaces helped me to feel that about those places. So I needed art really to feel good in those spaces under the elevated tracks. So we know from history and archaeology that humans have always crafted items for daily use that were both practical and decorative. But if asked today, I imagine that most of us would say that art is the thing we go to see and contemplate in museums, right? Not something we appreciate while running errands or commuting to work. Our modern experience is largely one of alienation from anything that we might label art with a capital A. And that, to use some quite large brushstrokes here, very large in fact, that is our legacy from Enlightenment thinkers like Kant here, who emphasized our own individual powers of judgment, our reason, and suggested that these allow us to appreciate certain experiences as beautiful. The result, again, large brushstrokes here, the result is our modern shift toward mental experiences. So that's the world of abstract ideas in our own individual heads, and away from the physical world. And really, I want to knock on wood, away from the physical world that we touch and that we inhabit. And also a growing gap between the work of art and the work of our everyday lives. As well, I mentioned this before, an emphasis on the subjectivity of aesthetic taste. The pink flamingos, the garden bench, etc. And as others have argued, Kant's aesthetics tend toward alienation, so that art is separated from knowledge, art is separated from action, artists are separated from the physical world, artists are separated from other artists, and finally, art is separated from society. Add in mass production, add in consumerism, and is it any wonder that you and I, for the most part, tend to think of art as a very small, isolated part of our lives? But placemaking, that can help return to us an idea of art as something essential to what it means to be a human. So not an elitist hobby, not the thing we do or we enjoy doing in our spare time, but essential to our well-being and the well-being of the world. But because we are gathered here to talk and learn about how to build this community, that the gathering, the conversation, as well as the planning, even the decision making, and then eventually the building, these are all highly creative activities. The creative art-making urge in each one of us, everyone here, it's too strong to be fully separated from our lives and from our community. The key, I think, is to recognize the creativity in ourselves and in our neighbors, and acknowledge its value, really in everything that we embark on together. Art matters, and we are all artists. Wendell Berry, if you aren't already acquainted with his work, is a Kentucky farmer and a writer. He's also well known for his novels, his poetry, his essays. He's a cultural critic, he's an environmental activist, and so he is by any definition an artist. And yet he extends that definition to each of us. He says on the one hand that the arts are essential to our lives, but then he defines the arts very broadly. He says, when I speak of arts, I would prefer to mean simply the ways of making things. He says, we have been using the term in the sense of fine arts. But when a culture is doing well, all its artifacts are made well and afford the kind of solace that only beautiful work can give. If our ability to make things has degenerated to the point that we must go to museums to see art, then we no longer have art. Our museum is a mausoleum. So those are Wendell Berry's words. Museums, of course, are wonderful. We need them. I love them. But are these the only places that we encounter art? If so, the arts don't any longer have a living, active role in our lives and in our communities. When I talk about the art of placemaking, I am talking about art not as an object we go to see, or not that only, but as something we live with, engage with, even participate in. If art is central to our humanity, and art has been isolated into smaller and smaller portions of our lives, then we might say that those who are involved in the work of placemaking really have a unique opportunity to restore something essential to our daily life. In fact, I would argue that community planners, decision makers, engaged citizens, they can do more than anyone else to help bring a wealth of meaning back into our day-to-day lives. It's a weighty responsibility. It's also really an incredible opportunity. I mean, it's simply common sense, right? I think it's common sense to acknowledge that we feel differently when we're walking in the woods or sitting on a beach, enjoying a picnic under a big shade tree. And it is equally common sense to acknowledge that artfully made places for commuting, working, shopping, learning, just all of our living, can improve our collective sense of well-being. But where there is great potential, there is also danger, I think. And the shadow side of Barry's words is that if we are all creative, then certainly in the larger world, we are not all using our creativity well. And the most irresponsible artists, he uses that word, irresponsible artists among us, may be those who don't understand or accept that they are artists, that they are creative, or that how the things they are making, why that matters so much. I learned about the art of placemaking not in a class or a book, but really because of this house. I encountered it, came face to face with the art of placemaking in this house. 10 years ago, I moved with my family to Pennsylvania, just down the road from here in West Grove. And that summer, my husband and I we'd flown up from our home in northern Florida to find a house. We had 2 days to do it, and we could not fail because I was 8 months pregnant with our youngest. And we told our realtor we wanted an old house. We thought an old house would have lots of bedrooms, and we hoped that extended family might be able to come and live with us one day. We wanted a bit of land because I had been longing to grow a garden. And we were thrilled to find this house called Maplehurst. We were thrilled when the generous sellers agreed to rush the whole process so we could move in 3 weeks later. And we were especially grateful to find an old house on which so much restoration work had already been done. But the day we moved in, one of the young men who worked for the moving company, I remember he stopped carrying his boxes, and he stood there and he got this kind of like dreamy look on his face, and he smiled up at the house and he said, I just love that you two bought a fixer-upper. And I was shocked. I mean, I was even slightly offended. Like, fixer-upper, what was he talking about? I just couldn't see what he saw. And it's a good thing, I think, too. Or I might never have been brave enough or maybe crazy enough to take it on. But the truth we would discover in time is that, yes, while the work had been begun, and begun well, there were years and years of restoration projects in store for us. And despite our pedigree, fairly experienced pedigree as DIYers, we would not be able to do this work alone. Some of the craftspeople that we found to work with us, I mean, they had been perfecting their skills and learning about old materials for decades. So restoring Maplehurst has been, for me, really a crash course in placemaking as a community venture. But the art inherent to good placemaking and the potential for a built place to have an almost living spirit, something which feels like much more than the sum of its parts. This began to be revealed to me on the very first night that we spent in the house. It was the 1st of August, so it was very hot. The house at that time didn't have air conditioning. All the windows were open. We put our kids to sleep on mattresses upstairs. I was hot, tired, very pregnant, ready to go to bed. Started to head upstairs, but we hadn't yet plugged in the lamps. I didn't yet know where the light switches were. And I kind of stumbled to the stairs, and then I realized that the stairwell was just flooded in light. And I just sat down right there on that step and looked up because there was a big window at the turning of the stairs, a Victorian 2/2 window. And centered in this window was this enormous full moon. And talk about a welcome home. I think I knew then that this was not just a house, whatever we mean when we say not just a something, right? This house had been shaped and planned and placed with care. Some person had done that, checked their compass, watched for the rising of the moon and the setting of the sun, and marked out the boundaries for this place and figured out where that window needed to go. And now 130 years later, I'm receiving that careful work of their hands, and it felt like a gift. And I really think it was the grace of that moment that sort of gave us what we needed in order to persevere through 10 years, really, of work on the house. I think we knew the place was worth it and that we should at least try. And one reason that we're gathered here is that so many visionary placemakers have built Kennett Square and the surrounding communities so well. So there are the names we know, like William Penn, Pierre Dupont at Longwood, but there have been so many other slightly more anonymous placemakers. We learn from them, we walk in their footsteps, we inhabit the places that they made, even if we don't always know their names. But this man, Mark Hughes, along with his wife, Priscilla Hughes, he built a beautiful house, planted rows of maple trees, called the place Maplehurst. But the qualities that make the house beautiful, they're actually hard for me to put my finger on. There are many brick houses in the world, right? What makes these bricks beautiful? The shape is overall is simple, but it's pleasing. I like the little detail of the curve over the windows, but these are not the things that really impact what it feels like to be inside this house. Instead, the house feels good, and I call it beautiful because of the way that moonlight puddles down the stairs, because of the way that the curved bay windows on the second and the third floors, they really spotlight the setting sun. It's beautiful because I am led around this house from room to room, season by season, by the light. The house is really a vessel for light. And there was one particular summer, not long after we'd moved in, we had teams doing some different projects at the house, like teams of workers, which we didn't normally have, and I don't even remember what the projects were that they were working on, but I vividly remember two men who on two separate occasions, I had conversations with them. They were there to work on the house, and they took time to to talk with me out in the yard around the house, and they shared almost exactly the same words with me. This place, they said, reminds me of my home. One of these men had been born in Vietnam. The other man who was working with us a few weeks later was originally from Mexico. So Vietnam, Mexico, Pennsylvania, each place so different and each place so far apart. And yet, as we stood outside, kind of leaning against the split rail fence and watching some of our chickens range around, pecking, it's like we kind of relaxed, and both of those men said, "This place reminds me of my home." And truthfully, on summer days, when the chickens are out, I am also reminded of home. My father always kept chickens in our Texas backyard, and while neither man exactly mentioned the chickens, perhaps it was that for each of us, that it was just something about the green quiet of a house, a fence, some tall trees, a flock of chickens, and we all breathed a little deeper and felt this sense of home. So a sense of home, what does that mean? Is it a sense of peace, perhaps? Is it a sense of belonging, of safety, maybe of abundance? We might use different words. We might point to different elements. Our vision of a good place or our vision of home may or may not have chickens in it. But when three people from such different places can all stand in one place and say together, "Yes, this feels like home," then I think we have so much reason to hope that together we can, across our differences, and I won't even say despite our differences, because I think there is a necessary energy and even a creativity that comes from our differences. I feel so hopeful that we can build places that we all can love, which is how Bo began our time tonight, talking about the importance of places we can love. But there's something else about my conversations with those two men. We were all talking about home, and yet a sense of distance from home, even if you will, an experience of displacement lay behind our conversations. Maybe we were all a little homesick even. And so I acknowledge the potential of our placemaking to heal what ails us individually and collectively if we take care with it and if we attend to the art of it. Because even if you were born in Kennett Square or West Grove, I know that this place has changed around you. And that is rarely an easy or an enjoyable experience. Maybe you haven't moved a mile, but home no longer feels like home. What can placemaking offer you? Because isn't the making of places simply more change, more development, which is almost a dirty word in some of our conversations, as if development must always equal loss and never gain? And of course, in towns and cities across the country, we're also having conversations about gentrification, by which we mean the kind of changes that lead to more displacement, less belonging. And I've learned that restoring an old house is about healing, which for me and my family hasn't meant that it is always a matter of historic preservation, but rather one of intentional storytelling. And this was all explained to me by John Littner of Building Preservation Services. He's right in West Grove. And he was helping us restore our old windows on our house. And he said we had a decision to make. So when we moved in, the windows all had the old sash ropes, but the ropes were all frayed and broken. So if you could open a window, you needed a stick or a stack of books to keep the window up. And he said we had a decision. He could repair the ropes for us, and they would serve us well for a while, and eventually down the road, the ropes would fray again, and they would break again, and we would replace, or someone would replace the ropes. Or we could use brass, like metal chains, which would essentially last forever. And I asked him, how can we do that? Isn't it our job to restore, what we found, what was here? But he explained that if the house had been cared for all along, this change probably would have been made at some point. So it was up to us, really, the story that we wanted to tell. But in time, one fallible material would have been replaced with a more durable one. So were we trying to return the house to the past? Or did we want to care for the house in ways that gave it more strength, and resilience for the future? So were we trying to take it back to the past? Or were we trying to make it stronger for its future? That was the question that he proposed for us. So we went with the chains. Sometimes healing a place looks like restoration. Sometimes it looks like innovation. And I'm not here to say for every project, every placemaking opportunity, which is the right one. But we do have these stories, we do have these decisions to make, and it can come down to the stories that we're trying to tell in a place. And gardening, it turns out, is similar to the restoration of an old home. It's an art both of maintenance, so keeping beloved plants going year after year, and also embracing change and growth. The initial plan for my flower garden at Maplehurst, I sketched it out on graph paper. It made a very pretty picture, very symmetrical, very traditional, formal, but overflowing with informal plant life. And the garden we made followed that plan and made a very pretty picture. And despite how it looks on this illustrated plan, I didn't completely neglect the needs of actual bodies in the space. I reserved room and 2 beds for benches, but the benches were pretty quickly overwhelmed by the plants. But again, what a pretty picture. Even the bench I could not sit on made a pretty picture. And every time I showed friends or visitors the flowers in my garden, we would walk in and walk around, and then that circular path would spit us right back out again. So last year I set out to alter my original plan. My husband and I, we dug out the circular bed of flowers in the center. In effect, we took an eraser to some of the beauty. We made the picture less pretty, not more. And we built new gravel paths. We filled the center with gravel. We brought in a lounge chair, a glass-topped table where we could sit, an umbrella. And then we recognized that we had, in these ways, made a better place. Even, I would say, a more beautiful place. Because now this garden had space for us and had become not just a pretty picture, but a place in which we could be. Not a place to look at and admire, which is more or less what I had before. Not a place to pass through without stopping, but a place that welcomed us and even embraced us in a way that feels to me a lot like the way the brick farmhouse Mark Hughes built. Is a house that embraces and holds and makes space for people and for light. So the farmhouse called Maplehurst isn't just a pretty picture, a thing to look at and admire, but because it holds light like a vessel, because it daily frames the sun and the moon, and because there is beauty in both the larger design and then all the way down through the details of brass chains and porcelain doorknobs, my experience of the house is that it somehow feels alive, the way a garden feels alive. And the art of placemaking likely has the most in common, I think, with the art of making gardens. Certainly both involve art and science, which is why I think they are such great creative endeavors for whole communities, not just for individuals. To bring the art and the science together is to try to link the function of a place with feeling, to link the materials with meaning, and even with our collective memories, our stories. But I'd like to begin to conclude my talk tonight by slipping in one final art form, and that's the art of poetry, believe it or not, because poetry is actually a spatial and a visual art form, as well as being, oral, we listen to it. So instead of bricks, instead of plants, it builds with words. But just like the building of towns and communities, just like the making of gardens, a well-made poem recognizes the importance of space, even empty space or connecting space, like the space at the center of my garden, or the space that holds that table in the garden, or the space that is the staircase at Maplehurst that holds the light. In a poem, even the blank white spaces between the words and between the lines is meaningful. So poetry as an art form speaks in words, but also in the pauses between the words. So for instance, there is a famous poem by the American modernist poet William Carlos Williams, and it relies on, in order to be a poem, it relies on the pauses, it relies on the line breaks and the blank spaces on the page, and it's called This Is Just to Say. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold. Now, what is the difference between that poem and a note scribbled hastily and stuck on the refrigerator? Why is it that some words remain flat and utilitarian on the page and never really rise up? And how is it that the same or nearly the same words can be made to sing? And what is the difference between a red brick farmhouse placed just anyhow, in which we can never really tell what's happening in the sky outside, and a red brick farmhouse placed precisely where it can catch and hold a full moon in the sky? And what is the difference between a collection of healthy green plants and some colorful flowers spread out at the base of a building that stirs no emotion in us, and those same plants used to make a garden that embraces us and fills us with joy to be just exactly where we are? I recognize that so much of what I've shared tonight about beauty, it is difficult to catch hold on, and I'm coming right to the end here. It's a quality that it isn't always as obvious and bold as we think it might be. To make beautiful places, we can't content ourselves just with making sweeping aesthetic judgments that label bird baths and benches in the garden beautiful and pink plastic flamingos are not beautiful, and that's the end of the story. It's much more subtle than that. Because in the end, it's not about a superficial prettiness. It's not about a two-dimensional picture only, but if we take our time, if we pay attention to how we feel, if we accept that no detail is too small to affect the whole in enormous ways, like remember our moths, then I think we are ready to build beauty into the life of our community. The spreadsheets might look good, the two-dimensional design might look good, but there are more questions we need to ask, more things we need to consider in order to know whether we are about to build a refrigerator note or a poem, a dull red brick box or a vessel of light, a pretty garden or a garden embrace. It's the difference between a dark and dingy underpass and a coffee shop with a public art exhibit sheltered under the train tracks. And it's the difference between a perfect green lawn and a wildflower meadow that is teeming with life. And the differences in any one place, they may seem small and subtle and hardly worth taking into account, but these differences are actually everything. Thanks, everyone. Do we have a minute?
Yeah, I think we have time for questions if anyone has a question for Christie. You can just raise your hand.
Shout it out. Yeah.
Does making a good home actually exaggerate our sense of displacement?
Does making a good home,
We're talking about that there's
yeah.
this, but do you think that the better you make the home, the more displaced you feel?
Now there's a question. So as someone who has been longing for beauty my whole life, I am aware that the more I cultivate it, the more I make it, the more I see other things and the more I feel like I'm not quite reaching my goal. So I know as an artist, a writer, a creative person, I am always aware of the poem I haven't written or the garden I haven't made. And there's a tension there because it at once calls us to go on making. And so maybe we try this, we try to be placemakers and we don't do it perfectly. We do feel a sense of failure. I want to say I've been there and, get out the shovels and try again with the garden and, make it better and go on. But it's absolutely a tension that we feel. I work I have to work to feel satisfied in certain spaces because I'm always imagining the next project, the next change, the next thing. And so it can be hard to be just where I am. And it helps that we can do these things in community, that other people maybe aren't always seeing the imperfections we're seeing or that falling shortness we're feeling and so on. But they can say, hey, I love being in your garden. But I'm certainly aware of that tension. Yes?
I just wanted to say that just reading Placemaking, it felt like home just reading
Oh.
the book.
That's really lovely to hear. That's lovely. We can make homes in all kinds of ways, can't we? Okay.
It just
Yeah.
warmed my heart putting the book down, picking it up. I also have
Thank
some
you.
history similar to your Chicago.
Yeah.
And West Grove, I have an old house in West Grove, so it just felt like
Thank you. I'm going to say the children's book I used to read to my kids where it was like a such and such is a house for this and a house for that. And it went all the way down to like a pocket is a home for your hand or something, like, all these different kinds of houses, all these different things that could be shelters. And so you're reminding me that, we can live in a poem, we can live for a while in a book and maybe soothe that, that tension that we're feeling. Yeah.
And I have one more comment. As a Christian,
Uh-huh.
I also feel that we've been so blessed and we have so much, and I have a sort of guilt feeling about having so much. Your book reminded me that you're made in God's image and He is the creator, and that we are just mirroring in creating
Yeah.
beautiful places.
Yeah.
We're just mirroring the image that He created in us.
Yeah.
So I felt more comfortable loving my garden,
Good.
loving my
I'm glad. You know, I'm glad because something else I thought about this week preparing this talk is that many of us, we've been following the news around the world, the terrible war, and it's very easy in times of war or hardship to think that beauty is the thing that now is matters even less, right? Because when we're suffering, when things are hard, surely that is just the thing for when we secure peace, or we have extra money in the budget, or we have extra time, then we can pursue beauty, then we cultivate beauty. And instead, I think I choose to see war as the unmaking of places. And so this cultivation of beauty is actually, it turns out, quite an active way of resisting the nightmare of war. And so in that sense, like those seeds back there, that is the tool we use to make and build and grow this place in ways that quite actively, I think, are peacemaking. So placemaking as peacemaking. So it matters, it does. Did I see another? Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, I love the example of in the public realm in Chicago, you know, and not going through later.
Yeah.
The example of your home, the intentionality of the builder, and you recognizing that, right, or experiencing that. I think of like walking in like Siena or like in very lovely cities. There is an aspect that I've experienced of feeling more at home, you know, in a small town in the Netherlands than I've ever felt, you know, in any home that I've ever lived in, let's say. I wonder, are there parts of the public realm in this area of, you know, West Road, Kennett, Westchester kind of area that you can also point to a past intentionality like your home, right? You know, the framing of the window that also have that sense of home and place. You know, what do you love in the public realm of these areas?
Yeah, you know what's interesting, so before moving here, I was 10 years in Chicago in this neighborhood on the south side, and then briefly in Florida. Sorry, I can feel my microphone, I'll step into the sound. Briefly in Florida, and then moved here. And when, the story I didn't tell is when we were house hunting on the 2 days, we didn't know this area at all. But we were headed here, and I hoped it could feel like home. And so we put an offer on Maplehurst. We're waiting to hear, and we came here to Kennett Square, to the main street, and we, for the first time, stepped into I think Tallulah's and a bookstore, and had a blueberry scone. And I told my husband, I feel like we're in Chicago. Now, why? Is anyone here thinking, yeah, Kennett Square, it's just like the south side of Chicago? Because it isn't visually, I guess, except I think if I were to analyze it, I'm sure there are, the meeting of the bakery with the sidewalk with the cafe table. I'm sure there were visual, let's call them patterns at play that I was now stepping back into. Some of it must have been that. But I think it was realizing, like, in the city we had what we needed close by, and we could walk to it. And as soon as we parked here, I could do that. I could walk and get the scone. I could walk and get the books at the shop. And so I know we've talked about parking, we've talked about traffic patterns and so on in this series before. But I think it was just incredible that I could have that sense of homecoming and that sense of, like, this was the place I loved. Move. I lost that place, and now in some sense I've found it again. So I don't want to say this place is well built just because it's built like Chicago. That's not what I'm saying. And yet there is some, and maybe it's what you experience in Europe as well. There's something about places that are built for humans and human scaled that we feel it in our bodies. And I felt it here, and I thought, oh, we could be at home here. We could be at home here. So, I feel like it would take me even longer really to fully answer that, except to say that I felt that in this place. Also, I will say trees. That's another thing. The neighborhood that I really felt at home in Chicago was a neighborhood of trees, Hyde Park, so lots of old trees. And coming here, we know that that's part of the legacy of this place, whether we're talking about the trees that were saved at Longwood or street trees that are planted, the old maples, at our place. But that valuing of trees and what they do to create space was something else that I felt in that city, and I feel here as well. Plant trees, take care of your trees.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is, so I'm not yelling at you, sick is my So my question is, how do we gain the confidence to tell a better story and build better places? I can't tell you how many times, with our last speaker, a guy named Chuck Marone, we once were working for the city of Akron. We were standing, there's this kind of big gap between the city. There was this amazing stone bridge. We were standing there with the city leaders. They needed to build another bridge. They were all talking about how beautiful that bridge is and how they're just going to build an ugly bridge to replace it. And we were kind of standing around saying, that one's beautiful, why can't you do that? And no one, we had engineers around us, no one felt confident that they could do that. So we couldn't build what 200 years ago, immigrants from
Exactly.
Europe built. And here I have conversations all the time where, preservation, the impulse there, I understand it, but a lot of it's driven by this fear that we're incapable, we're afraid of stepping in and being brave and telling a better story. So how do we gain the confidence to do that?
I'm remembering as you were asking that, again, I'm not saying Chicago, great place, Kennett Square can learn. I'm not doing that, but it's just from my own placemaking history. What it took for me to appreciate those murals was a community group that had made it their business to learn all about them and transmit that knowledge and tell those stories and invite people into it. And you'd see the groups going around and you wanted to find out what they were learning. And so bringing people into that conversation. And so maybe some of that fear comes from the fact that the decision making is happening here. And yes, there may be a meeting posted, but really, how are we listening to one another in order, I think once we've taken the time to listen to people, then we can be brave to make a decision. But if we're just making decisions and we're worried about what's the protest going to be, what's the response going to be, then I think there's going to continue to be this fear in it. Now, I know that's more complicated. I know that's complicated. We actually had a great experience not too long ago, my husband and I, wanting to make a change on our property, and it required going through a lengthy and not easy process with our local zoning board. And there were aspects of that were hard, just to follow the letter of the law and do all of that paperwork and we had to invite our neighbors to speak into what we were doing. We had to send them letters, and everything didn't go according to plan. It was complicated, but there was a moment where I was sitting in the township room to have the hearing, and I thought oh, this is I'm in an old movie, with Jimmy Stewart. This is small town, and I thought, oh, this is a sense of connection with my place and with the decision makers and local government that I had been missing. And so how to give more people that sense of no, you belong in these spaces where these decisions are being made, and we want to hear from you. Yes, it's quixotic. It is a bit I want to bring back the black and white movie world, and yet I don't really know how else it can be done except in community, listening to one another, telling those stories, inviting more people into the stories that we want to tell. I think one advantage we have here is that we are accustomed to beautiful spaces and beautiful things, and when you have them side by side, I think it is easier to say to people, see, we do love this. Do we want more of this? It's actually harder in places where maybe hasn't been that legacy, and there aren't those beautiful made things in the environment, where maybe there isn't access even to a beautiful space like this. But if we keep pointing people to these things, if we keep saying, how do you feel in this space? Can we do more of that? Then hopefully. So I think if anybody can do it, we can do it, right? I think so. Yeah.
When you're talking about your garden and getting rid of the flowers in the middle of the
Yeah.
pathway, I think you said beauty needs to make
Yeah.
That'd be art. So if that's the case, then things made without space for humans would be what? I don't know what word you'd use there, because
Yeah.
it was beautiful before.
It was, yeah.
But it's not really enough, or
Right.
how would you?
Yeah, how would I describe that? Because I was aware as I was putting that together that, for instance, I love going to museums and looking at flat two-dimensional art. That's a wonderful experience. So how to talk about this in a way that I'm not saying that the two-dimensional picture is somehow less than. At the same time, this is the amazing thing about placemaking and garden making, is that you can paint a picture and invite people to come on in. So it isn't one is better than the other, but how wonderful that we get to experience both. So I know I have stood in front of paintings where I thought, like the children in the Narnia book who get sucked into that painting of the ship. I want to get sucked into it. But we can't do that. But we can do that in our spaces. So what a shame if that's the opportunity in a space to close it off in that way and say, here, you can only look at me, see me, but you can't come on in. Better to have a place where people can come in, even if what they're experiencing is now slightly less, because my garden currently does not look as good in pictures, which bothers me as a photographer and a book writer. But it's better. It is. Even though I recognize the pictures don't look as good anymore.
Perfect. Well, we'll wrap up with that. Again, Christie's books. Well, let's give her a round of applause real quick.
Thanks, Bo.
Thank you so much. And again, the books are available at the back. I know all the books that are for sale are signed. If you brought a book, it sounds like there's a few people that read some of her books ahead of time. She could probably sign that as well. Our next speaker is May 17th. It's a guy named Steve Nygren that developed a really kind of special community that I think we could learn a lot from. The community is called Serenbe in Georgia. So again, that'll be May 17th, same place. Again, pick up the seed packets at the back based on the inspiration from Christie, and also learn more about Kenneth Blooms and how you can support that. So thank you all.
Thank you.